From the beginning, Korea has been preoccupied with various superstitions and ridiculous popular beliefs. The main sects are the various sects of Buddhism, shamanism, heaven, Konsihak, Tai-ukin, and Su-ukin. From the beginning, amidst these ludicrous errors, some people with an upright conscience recognized the true God in a natural and rational light and served him through their religion. Recently, in Peking, some Jesuits rose to high office, and a few men, distinguished by the title of magistrate and scholar, returning from Peking, spread the idea of the Christian religion in Korea. Christian books were also brought in. At the same time, the philosopher Hwang recognized that there is a God, the creator of all things, as the reason of natural things, and by studying books about the Catholic religion, he understood the truth, and although he was not baptized, he began to honor God like the Christians do. However, he had no basic knowledge of the religion yet, and he did not know the laws of the church, so he just kept the seventh day of each month holy. Of course, to some extent, he simply knew from ancient traditions that the seventh day was more honorable than other days. He ended his life enjoying the full span of life and praised for his holiness. Since then, many other philosophers eventually came to recognize God, who creates and provides for all things in the universe. Among them, one famous person was Byeok, who was later baptized with the name of John the Baptist. As a great scholar, he studied much about the doctrine of the true God. At that time, when he heard that Catholicism, a religion serving the Lord of Heaven, was prevalent in Peking, he was planning to send some people there to bring back books about the religion. At a given moment in the winter of 1783, a delegation of the regular winter envoys to China was leaving for Peking. Yi Seong-hun, the son of the third ambassador, Seoul, came to visit Byeok and informed him that he was leaving for China. So Byeok seized the good opportunity. He told Yi Seong-hun that when he arrived in Peking, he should visit the Western people called Jesuits. To meet them, get books on the religion of the Lord of Heaven. So Yi Seong-hun visited the Bishop of Peking as soon as he arrived in Peking. He was warmly welcomed by the bishop and was baptized. At the time of the baptism, he received the name of Peter. When he left Peking, he brought books about the Catholic religion and sacred objects to Korea. Thus, the Christian religion was introduced to Korea in 1784. Many scholars and officials realized the truth of the Catholic religion and became fascinated by it, and began to believe in Christ. Regardless of status, many people of all classes began to turn away from the errors inherited from their ancestors and turn to the true God. At that time, Yi Seong-hun, Kwon Il-sin, Yi Jun-chang, Yi Dan-won, Choi Chung-hyun, and Yu Hang-byong were very enthusiastic. They elected bishops and priests among themselves, celebrated all the sacraments including baptism, confirmation, and confession, and many believers gathered and celebrated Mass solemnly. As the number of believers increased, bishops and priests made an effort to convert the whole of Korea to their religion. Then, when they accidentally realized their error, they immediately stopped the celebration of the Mass and the sacraments and sent someone to the Bishop of Peking to report on their mission and all their actions to date. After hearing all this, the Bishop of Peking ordered that the Korean bishop and priest no longer perform the sacraments. They obeyed this command and repented of their mistakes, and later, when persecution broke out, they all gave their lives for the faith. The religion was not free for very long. 7 years after it was introduced into Korea, that is, in 1791, the court of the Joseon Dynasty was in an uproar because of factional conflict between the Byeokpa and the Shipa. The Shipa was a faction in opposition to the Byeokpa, and the Christian religion was introduced into Korea by the Shipa. So the people in the Byeokpa poured all their resentment against those in the Shipa on the Christians. With the permission of the king, they initiated a persecution to annihilate the name of Christian from Korea. The king reluctantly gave permission. It was the first nationwide persecution, the Sinhae persecution. In this persecution, Paul Ji-chung, an outstanding scholar, fought valiantly for the faith of Christ and was martyred, shedding his holy blood for the faith in the Catholic religion. He was the first martyr of Korea. In the following years, relatively calm conditions continued, but in 1795, persecution broke out and many believers were killed. In that same year, the Chinese priest Father James was dispatched to Korea. For the next 7 years, believers enjoyed peace. In the meantime, the number of believers increased a lot. However, when the king, who was generous to Christians, Jong-jo, passed away, the country's supreme power returned to Kim Tae-pi, Queen Jong-sun. That's why the Byeokpa, also known as Noron, after holding their breath under the power of the members of the Namin faction for many years, now woke up in opposition against the Namin. The members of the Byeokpa were hostile to the Christians, and the Namin were mostly Shipa and favorable to the Christians. Many of the Namin members were Christians. Now the real power in the country passed from Namin to Noron. Thus, Queen Jong-sun, who belonged to the Byeokpa of Noron, persecuted mainly Catholics, as recommended by the ministers of Byeokpa Noron, and tried furiously to destroy the name of Christian in Korea. She thus issued an edict ordering that all the servants of Christ should be executed. This was the third persecution that took place 18 years after the entry of the religion into Korea, namely in 1801. Through this persecution, countless dignitaries, nobles, even Christian princesses, and the king's sister-in-law were killed. Father James Zhou Wen-mo also received the crown of martyrdom after being betrayed by a demonic believer named Kim Yo-sam. However, peace was given to the believers for several years after the death of the persecutor Great Queen Kim. Not long after, however, a great persecution of believers raged in 1816. In this fourth persecution among Korean believers, Ambrose Kim Gun-mi was caught after surrendering voluntarily because of his faith in Christ. According to what is reported, he died in prison after 46 days, not touching a grain of food or a sip of water under God's instructions. At about the same time, the famous philosopher Alexis Hwang Sa-yeong, who was favored by the king, since the religion of Christ in his land was so oppressed and sorely troubled, wrote a letter to the Vatican asking for a warship to be sent to gain religious freedom by force. However, this letter was found and confiscated by satellites in Wiju. When they opened the letter, they saw nothing but white paper, but people capable of reading it reported everything to the judge. The persons who tried to deliver the letter were also caught and sent to the capital city of Seoul. Since then, the persecution of believers became even more vicious. Alexis was punished more severely, not only for religious matters, but also for this letter he had written, and his body was torn into 6 pieces. Subsequently, in 1819, 1828, 1833, and 1836, persecutions against the believers caused many believers to shed much blood for the sake of their faith with insurmountable persistence. In particular, in Cheongcheong-do, the second region of Korea, several persecutions took place, killing many Christians. In this way, Korean believers lived without a shepherd for 33 years. Meanwhile, thanks to God's protection, the number of believers did not decrease, but increased day by day. Finally, merciful God allowed shepherds into Korea. Thus, in 1831, Father Pacific Liu, a Chinese citizen, came in from China, then returned to China in 1835. In 1834, Father Malbount entered the country. In In 1835, Father Chastan, and in 1836, Bishop Imbert, Apostolic Vicar of Korea, entered the country. It seemed that it would be easy for pagans to convert. The number of believers increased greatly, the zeal for faith increased, and everything began to energize. However, in 1839, the 55th year after the introduction of Christianity into Korea, a new believer named Jang'an Kim Dae-geon was blinded by money and informed on lay believers as well as the priests. As a result, the fifth persecution occurred in the Korean church. The queen tried to stop such persecution but could not break the will of the Byeok ministers, especially Minister Zhou, who began to gain power at the time. In this persecution, Bishop Imbert, Father Malbont, Father Chastan, and nearly 200 believers were martyred. Now the total number of martyrs in the Korean church is 800 or more. For 5 years, from 1839 to today, believers have been able to enjoy peace, but without a shepherd, they could only cry and sigh. I sincerely hope that God, the compassionate and gracious Father, will promptly send shepherds to Korea to gather the scattered sheep and form one flock under one shepherd.